Good morning and welcome to the South American Sports History Shed here at the end of my garden in late January 2021. So in this short lecture I'm going to introduce how we define sports and how we might start to question some of those definitions and the way we think about sports in our lives and then in our studies over the next 3 months or so. So what is a sport? The desire to play is at the root of sports, and the desire to play is what makes us human. It's found in all cultures worldwide throughout all of history. Influential intellectuals such as Friedrich Schiller in his 18th century Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, and Johann Huizinga in his very influential Homo Ludens in the 1930s, have shown how the instinct to play creates both communities and art. Play is what humans do when their desire for freedom of movement of their bodies combines with the beauty of the curve of a ball through the air, the satisfaction of throwing an object at a target, or the joy of creating a new form with others or alone. The historian of sports, Alan Gutman, set out a typology of what play is and how it leads to sports, which I think is quite useful. So I'll talk you through it, and I've got it here lined up on the shed wall here in the chalk. So here we have play, which is this universal thing which can lead towards art and theatre and music, and also has aspects which lead in towards physical activities, which we now call sports. So Gutman says that you can divide play into spontaneous play and organised play. So spontaneous play might be activities like chase or catch, which we just do because they're fun, but they're not formally organised. They kind of happen when you're at a picnic or in the garden or hanging around with friends, and they're not organised, they just stop, and so they're not sports. So spontaneous play falls off of our definition, and we follow the line which is going to go down towards sports on the floor there through organised play. So organised play is the root of what we call sports. So Gutman splits organised play into competitive games, that's here, and non-competitive games, which are organised, but they're not competitive. So you might say that here in competitive games, you have a match, a football match, and then a non-competitive game of football might be where two people try to keep the ball in the air for as long as possible, or stand on either sides of stationary traffic during rush hour and try and keep the ball over the top of it for as long as they can. So that's fun, it's a game, but it's not competitive, so therefore it's not a sport. We'll come back to that a little bit later on, that distinction between competitive and non-competitive. So if we follow the organised play to competitive games, we then get to Gutman's distinction between competitive games which are intellectual or physical. And it's the physical competitive organised games which become sports. So competitive games are the ones that become sports, and intellectual ones, chess, bridge, dominoes, aren't sports because they're not physical. A sport is a physical contest which is a competitive game growing out of organised play. There are many debates which have continued into our own day about what is or isn't a sport, therefore, and all of these debates take place on the fringes of this definition. So enthusiasts for chess or bridge say, well, they're sports. You require a lot of physical endurance to sit and concentrate in the same place for a long time. So why isn't darts in the Olympics? That's clearly physical, competitive and organised. And then on the other end of things, around the competitive thing, sports like gymnastics, surfing or roller skating, it's a bit of a push to turn those into competitive things and to judge them as such with marks out of 10, when the ethos of many of the practitioners of surfing, skateboarding and in history of gymnastics is absolutely opposed to turning play into competition. So there we have, just to have it clear, play is organised, it's a competitive game rather than a non-competitive one, and it's physical as opposed to intellectual. So that's your definition of sport. As we'll see then, the tensions over what sports were for in South America explain many of the historical processes that we'll be looking at. And we're going to start off next week looking at the organised, competitive and physical activities that indigenous and colonial societies did in late 19th century South America, but which are traditionally not seen as sports. So now I want to move on and give you a broad timeline of what we're talking about in this course, and I've sketched a few important dates around me here which I'll refer to, and we'll see if you can see them behind me. So our course is looking at a century from 1850 to 1950. So in 1850, as we'll be looking at next week, the sporting landscape of South America will include animal sports, bullfighting, cockfighting, horse racing, and traditional games of indigenous and colonial societies that might involve throwing, catching, and other variants of these games, which traditionally haven't been called sports because they lack the organisation and competition which has been deemed important by scholars. Through the 1860s, we have an increasing amount of boating competitions in the Rio de la Plata, in the Bay of Rio de Janeiro and other coastal communities. So regattas taking place, sometimes linked to migrant communities, sometimes not. So some of the key dates that we have therefore are 1863, which is the date of the codification of the rules of association football in the Freemasons Tavern in London, set out as the foundational date of soccer globally. And 1867, the first association football match known to have taken place in South America, which is held in Buenos Aires. So you've got those two dates. Which one is more important? When it was codified, the rules were written down in England, or when it was first played in South America. Moving through our timeline, through the 1870s and the 1880s, we find in the newspapers and memoirs increasing prevalence of ball games being played across the continent, cricket, rugby, association football, largely being played by elites, often linked to schools, which is a question we'll come back to in a few weeks' time. So that's a gradual process through the 1870s and 1880s, the first games, the first publications of the rules and so on. So the crucial date, the next crucial date is up here, 1886, which is the invention of the safety bicycle, which is the bicycle that has two wheels the same size, rather than the penny farthing with one massive wheel and one small wheel. And the 1886 invention of the safety bicycle, which takes place in Paris and in Scotland at kind of the same time, leads to the industrial production of bicycles and a cycling boom around the world, construction of velodromes. And it's in 1892 that South America's first velodrome is opened. That's in Rio de Janeiro. But through the 1890s, there is a cycling boom in many cities across South America, construction of velodromes, bicycle races from Bogota to Buenos Aires, Lima, Quito, and so on. So through the 1890s, right in the middle of our period, that's when you have a cycling boom across much of South America, and certainly a football boom, foundation of clubs, foundation of leagues, and from 1900 through to 1920, that's when you have the growing up of football leagues in cities and regions across much of the continent. That's kind of the period when football is expanding, taking up a lot of public space in newspapers and people's lives, but still in competition with or existing alongside other sports. Those indigenous and colonial games we're going to talk about next week, but also athletics, boat racing, cycling, and so on. So it's kind of the multi-sport landscape. In terms of athletics, here we are. The key date that is often referred to by historians of sport is 1896. That's the organisation of the first modern Olympic Games, held in Athens and organised by a bunch of cosmopolitan aristocrats led by the founder of the modern Olympic movement, Pierre de Coubertin, who is very much in favour of this amateur rediscovery of Greek history and the importance placed on the physical body and athletic movement. So that's a key date, clearly, except very few South Americans are invited or present. So maybe a more important date for us is 1919, when the first South American Athletics Championships take place. And clearly the key date is in 1930, where global meets South American history and the first men's FIFA Football World Cup is held, and it's held in Uruguay. So that's a key moment for us, clearly. It's not something that happens elsewhere, like 1898 in Athens, or the safety bicycle invention, or the codification of the rules of association football. 1930 is where those things come together, and South America is, for the months of the duration of the tournament, South America is the centre of the sporting world. Through the 1930s, you have the professionalisation of football in Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and our final date is the World Cup men's football in 1950, held in Brazil, in the Maracanã Stadium, which is built precisely for that purpose, and records an attendance of 200,000 people in the stadium that day, watching this art form, this game of association football, which back in 1863 was only just having its rules set down. So we go from, at the start of our period, modern sports like soccer not existing, and 1950, 200,000 people crowding into a purpose-built modern piece of architecture in order to watch it. So in this third part of the lecture, I'm going to reflect upon the importance of how we think about our definitions of sports and what that means for the cultural meanings that underpin sporting activities in South America in the period that we're looking at. As we've seen, modern sports developed out of play and into formalised competitive contests at a time of global history when military conflict was requiring greater involvement and obedience from citizens. Hobsbawm and Ersterham will show that very clear in those readings. The recurrence of military vocabulary in sports, training, drilling, attacking, defending, shooting, and so on. I mean, it's not a coincidence, although we often take them for granted. This is a very military vocabulary in many sports. From the 1870s, boys in schools around the world were being deliberately moulded into citizens who would be able to participate in a large hierarchical army when required, some as calm officers, others as obedient soldiers. This vision of education began in the public schools of England and was adopted in state schools across the world, including South America, from the 1870s through to the early 1900s, with increasing urgency as world powers prepared for military conflict in the 1910s. The link between military training and sport was never coincidental, and this had global as well as national dimensions. Many of the South American sportsmen that we'll see in photographs and in text that we'll study, in fact, went on to fight in the First World War, including, for example, a Norman Riddle, who was a pupil at the Mackay and Sutherland School in Chile, one of the first people who played football in South America, and who later came to the UK and worked at Bristol Aerodrome in Filton, just up the road from here. Other examples include Lucien Massin, who was the Argentinian winner of one of the first Tour de France cycling, who died in a French military accident in 1917. So beyond these examples, sport provided training for a military model of citizenship and national service. But this idea of competitive sport as a preparation for war wasn't a British invention, far from it. As we'll see next week, South American indigenous and colonial sports were also framed by this language. The existing sporting subcultures were mobilized from a variety of places when ideas about the purpose of civilization and education and the scope of citizenship were undergoing major transformations. I think it's useful for me to say something to you just now about the way in which much sports history in South America and elsewhere is being researched and written within a paradigm set out by the sociologist Norbert Elias. For Elias and his collaborator Eric Dunning, sport and leisure, the existence of sports, the existence of leisure activities, leisure time, were products and catalysts of what they called the civilizing process, in which societies moved away from violence and towards self-control. Elias found the origins of modern sports in the nobility, aristocracy of England, France, and Germany, specifically Prussia, in the 18th century. And those aristocrats' daily lives as they moved towards a more controlled, civilized way of doing politics and of controlling their lands and the people who worked on them using less violence. Their book on sport, called The Quest for Excitement, is a wonderful longue durée historical exposition of why people started doing sport and how it emerged out of the way that elites removed themselves from everyday violence. So the best example is the way in which in hunting, nobles stopped chasing after the animals themselves and killing the animals to getting dogs or other animals to chase after the fox, for example, and encouraging the dogs on to do the hunting. So there's a removal from the sport of the sportsman from the actual moment of violence. And they argue that the way in which sporting activities evolve mirrors the way wars are conducted too, with the nobleman going away from leading from the front towards being at the back, telling people what to do and pushing the private soldiers into armed conflict. So the rise of sport is quite confusing because it takes place at a time of moves towards global warfare. And yet it also is, as George Orwell said, war minus the shooting. So sport is so powerful, but also confusing because surely, as Pierre de Coubertin and other sporting entrepreneurs and promoters in the late 19th century and today always say, sport is should be a way of reducing warfare, of promoting peace, so that nations can compete against one another, but on the athletics track rather than on the battlefield. So we'll explore some of those areas and those questions as we're going through the course. Of course, Norbert Elias's use of the term civilization rightly raises the heckles of many people today, with all its colonialist and patriarchal implications. And I share those concerns. I don't think it's necessarily always a useful term to use. And if we do use it, we need to think very carefully about what we mean by civilization. However, Elias and Dunning's writings on the civilizing process are useful to us precisely because they engage with the worldview of the elite who thought in these terms in the 19th century. Sport boomed in South America in the late 1800s at the same time as racist thinking shaped much public policy. In Argentina, a public educator who became president, Domingo Sarmiento, developed a binary of civilization or barbarism. And this idea and way of thinking about white culture in the cities and darker cultures in the rural areas of Argentina was really popular because of the prevalence at the time of social Darwinism, those ideas of the survival of the fittest, institutionalized racism, and even state-led attempts at genocide of inferior peoples. Charles Darwin's The Origin of the Species is published in the same decade as the rules of association football. And I think it's really important to see these ideas of social Darwinism and improvement of races alongside the development of modern sports. They're not one at the service of the other, but they develop in connected ways, as we'll see as we go through the course. Many of Domingo Sarmiento's contemporaries believed that they could and should be on the civilized side of that equation, whereas others saw barbarism in the physical sports and the emotions that they could unleash, leaving the indigenous, black and mixed race populations of South America to be unable to control their bodies and their emotions sufficiently to play by the civilized rules. In the early 1900s, these debates began to be shaped by global eugenicist ideologies. So as well as promoting the immigration of white settlers to South America and conducting military campaigns against indigenous societies who resisted nation states' incursions on their land, as is happening in all of these areas of southern Argentina, outside of Buenos Aires, and in southern Chile at the same time. So the national states are expanding and removing indigenous peoples from the lands, in Chile, conflicts which continue today with the Mapuche peoples. So at the same time as doing that, Sarmiento and his successors are seeing sports as a way of working with and improving their national populations. So we're going to look at how, by entering sports fields and behaving in certain ways, South American athletes could change notions of what civilized post-colonial societies might look at. So when a black Brazilian footballer shares a pitch with white elite players, when working class Chilean athletes are lining up at the start line against aristocratic white Chilean athletes, what does it mean when the black or the mixed race athlete wins that race? Sport, therefore, I'm going to propose that we see, was not a unidirectional civilizing process of sporting progress passed from Europe to the rest of the world, with the invention of football, the invention of golf, the invention of tennis spreading to South America and civilizing people. And that's kind of how Norbert Elias and people who followed him speculated it might work. In this unit, in the next couple of weeks, we'll be looking at the debates around which sports were civilized, what role there might be for violence on the field of play, and which South Americans should be encouraged or permitted to play them. So we'll think about race, class, and gender there. And I'd suggest that once we've thought about these issues, it might make us want to reconsider Mellon and the IOC's definitions of what a sport actually is. So we'll think about, what does it mean to say that some play has been organised? Does it need written down rules? What does it mean to say something is competitive? Do you need to write down the score and have a league table? And what does it mean to be physical? So that's what is a sport. There are clear definitions, but they're ones which the case studies we're going to look at in this unit will give us cause to reconsider, I think. And I very much look forward to exploring these questions with you.